Hello and welcome to the New Humanum channel. Our guest today is Major General Tim Cross CBE. Tim has had a distinguished army career with the British Army. He was deployed in Iraq, Northern Ireland and in the Balkan Wars. Tim, welcome to New Humanum.
Thank you.
Tim, a lot of people, when looking at a Christian soldier, would say there's a contradiction between being a Christian and being a soldier because of Christ's message of peace and love to all mankind. How would you, as a soldier and a Christian, answer that?
Well, it's obviously a question I've been asked a lot over the years, and it's one I've thought through a lot, and there's a lot of scriptural stuff we can talk about. But just to sort of hit the hammer straight on the head to begin with, I don't think Jesus was a pacifist. I think Jesus was a man who had huge physical and moral courage. He stood up against the authorities of his day, spoke out very strongly against them. He wasn't a religious man. I'm not a religious man. He was a guy who didn't have an awful lot of time for the establishment. But I think crucially in the Luke's Gospel narrative of the Last Supper, Jesus, having previously said to the disciples, go out on mission, don't take any money, don't take any staff and so forth, and heal the sick and so on, which they did very successfully. But in the Last Supper talk or narrative in his Gospel, Jesus says to the disciples, I did that previously, but now I tell you, for example, sell your cloak and buy a sword. And one of the disciples says, we've got 2 swords here, Lord. And he says, that's enough. So he's allowing swords in the room where he's having the Last Supper, and he allows them to carry those swords into the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, he doesn't allow them to use force at that point because he is going to the cross and nothing is going to stop him from going to the cross. But I would just pose the question, what's he doing allowing swords in that narrative if he's a pacifist? Now, that said too, I think there's a lot of scripture where we have to recognize the reality of a broken world. I mean, however one sees the story of the Garden of Eden and the Old Testament narratives and so on, my sense of the Garden of Eden story is basically mankind says to the good Lord, we'll be our own boss, thank you very much. I'll decide what fruit I'm going to eat. I'll decide what tree I'm going to climb. And from that moment on, we've lived in a fallen and broken world. And we have to do something about the reality of that.
Well, you lived your life in this fallen and broken world as a soldier. Was your faith ever a problem when you were in the army, or was it something which always gave you a succor, or did it cause practical problems in any way for you?
No, it was never a problem. I was raised, I think like many people, in what would have been called a Christian home, but I wasn't a church person. My mum and dad were not regular churchgoers, and Christ was not an issue for me in the sense that he was a part of my life until I was 30. I mean, my wife and I were married in a church. Our children were baptized in church because it was the thing to do. But actually, it did mean a little bit more than that for me. But the turning point was when I was 30 and I became a Christian, and I was a captain at the time. So for the rest of my career, I was a Christian soldier from then on. But the British Army has a lot of Christians in it, which is quite surprising to people. But when you see the world that we are living in, the broken and fallen world we're living in, as a soldier, words like sin and evil are not interesting theological words. They're a reality of a brutal world. I mean, I've watched what people do to each other in Northern Ireland. I've watched the mass graves being dug up in places like Iraq and the Balkans. We're very lucky in this country. Most people, the vast majority of people, thankfully, live relatively very peaceful lives. We're seeing the reality of Ukraine at the moment. But for soldiers, going through the experiences that we go through, people ask themselves some very sensible questions. What's going on here? Why do people do this to each other? And for a lot of people, that brings them to a very strong faith. And most of my strongest and best friends over the years have been Christian soldiers.
Do you think that the army is a Christian organisation?
Well, interesting, the hat badge of the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, which I did 2 years from 69 to 71 before being commissioned, that hat badge says, serve to lead, which is straight out of Philippians. And Jesus is often called the servant leader, the greatest servant leader, and his physical and moral courage in the way that he lived his life and so on. So a lot of our heritage, the British Army heritage, is rooted in biblical Christianity. It's about justice and righteousness. It's about serving people. And that's, felt very strongly in the British Army. And I was confirmed at Sandhurst, which was quite unusual really, but we had a very good chapel there, Academy Chapel, with some very good padres. And all through my career, we've had Christian padres running regular services, and they're pretty well attended, and they're pretty well attended on operations too.
And would you say that if you like, the moral backbone of the British Army, did you see that change over the course of your career? I mean, as I understand it, and I know from family members who've been in the armed forces, there was at one time a strict moral code about how officers should conduct themselves, for instance, in their personal affairs. Yeah. Adultery, divorce, these things were frowned on. I imagine that's changed, and perhaps not for the better.
It has changed, and I would certainly argue it's not for the better, but it does of course reflect the wider reality of the culture that we live in. So if you go back to the 70s and 80s, nobody attempted to write down what it meant to be an officer. I remember at Sandhurst, whenever I did something stupid, the Sergeant Major would lean across and whisper in your ear, "That's not very OQ, sir." OQ meant officer qualities. There wasn't anything defined, but you knew what he meant. What I'd done was wrong, and I should realise it was wrong and, correct it. And picking up your points, if an officer had an affair, he was basically out. I mean, you could not, if you were commanding a regiment and you abused your power, then you would lose your command. When you were posted to somewhere like Germany as a commanding officer, you were expected to take your wife and family with you. So adultery and theft and all the other things that go on in the world were frowned on very deeply in the military. Didn't mean to say it didn't happen. I mean, the British Army is a deeply flawed organisation because it's made up of people like me. So we had all the problems that society has, but the way we dealt with it was very different. In the 80s, that began to change, and we are now in a position where we have basically followed the cultural changes that have gone on. So there is no doubt that it is different. Now, that said, there have been quite a number of senior officers recently who've resigned as a result of failings in these sorts of moral areas. So I would argue that it's still a different culture within the military, but and there are those who would say it had to be reflective of the wider, so divorce and other things, are much more acceptable. And indeed issues like homosexuality, which, was a reason for being drummed out of the army. In fact, the guy who taught me to swim in Australia when I was about 5 was a man called Mike Calvert, known as Mad Mike Calvert. He was an original Chindit, one of the bravest men I've ever met, who was drummed out of the army after the war because he was suspected of being a homosexual. He ended up by working for my father with Shell, which is how we got to know him as a family friend, and I subsequently met him in later years. But that's obviously not the case today. So, yeah, definitely big changes that are reflective of a wider cultural change.
There have been suggestions sometimes, or I saw you reacting in print to a suggestion that the army should become a secular organisation. Yeah. And you argued strongly against that. To non-believers, to non-Christians, why should the army maintain any vestiges of a Christian ethos? What benefit is that to the army?
Well, I think the argument that I was responding to was written by a colonel who said that the army should be atheist and secular. First of all, the British Army is not a Christian army. It's always had men and women of other faiths, as in Muslim, Gurkha, and Nepalese, and all the other faiths that are represented, including atheists and people who would argue that they have no faith. I would argue that everybody is a person of faith. Everybody sees the world through the prism of their own beliefs, and they make their decisions on the basis of how they see the world. For me, being a Christian in the army means that I try to see the world through the prism of Christ. And what he would do and how he behaved and how he treated people. And I think that carries with it, you know, some pretty positive and seriously different outlooks than others. Now, I'm not saying that anybody who is not a Christian could not be a good soldier or a good officer. But overall, any organisation is built around the ethos, the underpinning foundation of what it believes in. It's culture. And I just think that the British Army culture, based around the biblical values, based around its heritage, is a much better army. And the obvious thing to do is to look at other armies that were not like that. And you don't need to look very far. Stalin's Russia, Pol Pot's Cambodia, Mao's China, Saddam Hussein, Milosevic, all the other hoods who commanded big armies and caused a lot of trouble around the world, who have no feelings at all about what they get up to. So Stalin's famous statistic, you know, a single death is a tragedy, but a million deaths is a mere statistic. Hitler's Germany, which was a mixture of secular atheism and also a lot of other barbaric things that were thrown in. And, you know, an army that was prepared to do what it did in 1941 in particular, when it invaded Russia and the way it treated people. Now, the British Army, again, is not perfect, but our underpinning ethos, I think, is very different to that which the Germans got up to, and indeed other armies like the Russian army got up to.
Do you think that is moral courage linked in some way to religious belief? I mean, do you believe that yourself? I mean, you must have seen hundreds, thousands of men under your command in your time. Displaying moral courage, was that in any way linked to personal belief?
To some degree, but again, it would be wrong to say that just, you know, you have to be a Christian to display moral courage. I mean, courage is a fascinating topic in its own right, and there's a clear distinction between physical courage and moral courage. And most people, men particularly, I think, but in the army, if they wanted one attribute that was told about them, it would be that they were courageous. And obviously that pans itself out in physical courage and dealing with the enemy and so on. Moral courage is different. Physical courage, you can prepare people for operations that they're going to be involved with in terms of the climate they're going to be involved with, you know, the desert, whatever, the sort of circumstances they're going to find themselves in, the enemy they're going to be up against and so forth. And so in a way you can prepare people for that. And then they react instinctively as a result of their training in difficult situations. Moral courage is very different. Moral courage, I think, is when we're prepared to risk everything on the basis of something we believe strongly in, to stand up against wrong and to be prepared to sacrifice maybe our career to speak out. Now, it's people who are not Christians can do that and often do that. But again, for me personally, my own moral courage is undoubtedly strengthened as a result of becoming a Christian. I mean, I'd like to think I was morally courageous before I became a Christian, but that moral courage definitely changed having become a Christian, and I can give you a couple of examples of that.
I remember reading a senior military man saying that physical courage was an attribute which you could only go so many times to the well and draw upon, whereas moral courage, once exercised, strengthens. And so you can, the exercise of moral courage actually will lead to further.
Yeah.
Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is true. And courage has often been described as a muscle. The more you exercise it, the stronger it becomes. Physical courage, and we talk obviously about PTSD and shell shock and so forth. The way it's been described to me, and Lord Moran talked about this, Churchill's doctor talked about this, it's like having wine in a wine glass. You consume that, and if you don't replenish it, or money in a bank account is actually, I think, probably a better example. As you consume your money in a bank account, if you don't replenish it, you go overdrawn, and eventually you go bankrupt. And that's very true with physical courage. So often taking people out of an operation, taking people away from danger, enables them to replenish that courage. Moral courage, I think, again, is different. And people like Bill Slim argued, who I think was the greatest commander of British commander of World War II.
He was in Malaya, the Far East, wasn't
he was the guy who basically, the army in the Far East, commanded the army in the Far East. But he talks about moral courage again as being very different to physical courage. And once you exercise moral courage, I think it enables you to continue to be prepared to exercise it again in the future, and to be prepared to take the risk of what that may or may not lead to. So I've got no doubt at all that exercising courage, both physical and moral, but particularly moral courage, I think needs to be exercised. And when we walk away from wrong, we demean ourselves and we demean those we lead, and it's more likely to lead us to walking away again in the future.
You at one stage in your career, you were, I think as quite a junior officer, you were involved in bomb disposal, weren't you, in Northern Ireland? I mean, that must have taken a high degree of physical courage. Did you, I mean, was it dangerous? What did it feel like doing that?
Well, it is dangerous, but it was an interesting time actually, because in the early days in Northern Ireland, we had bomb disposal operators operating in Hong Kong, for example. One of the colonels I worked with had won a Queen's Gallantry Medal in Hong Kong for doing bomb disposal work. But in the early days in Northern Ireland, we lost quite a lot of operators because they were taking too many risks in all sorts of ways. And we then brought in psychometric testing. And what we were looking for were people who were prepared to follow processes and allow certain things to happen in certain ways to take away quite a lot of the risk. And we began to use a thing called wheelbarrow, which was a small tracked vehicle that you could use to go up and look at things, and indeed take weapons up to this box or car or whatever it was. So by the time I became an EOD operator in Northern Ireland, quite a lot of those processes and procedures were well established, and you were trained to use them sensibly. So you didn't just go up to a box and kick it to see whether it was going to go bang. You did all sorts of things beforehand. Now, ultimately, there were times when you had to put on an armoured suit, a bomb disposal suit, and physically approach the suspected weapon. You didn't know whether it was always a bomb or not, but sometimes it was a fake, sometimes it was a dummy, or sometimes it was real. So you had to go through that process. So yes, when you put that body armour on and you start walking towards this thing, it gets the heart beating. And there's no doubt about it, it is difficult. But interesting, one of the most famous bomb disposal operators, who I didn't know that well, but he's subsequently written about it, he talked about the time in the ops room waiting to go, waiting for the bell to ring for the next deployment. Because when you're actually dealing with the thing, you're following these processes and procedures, so you work your way through it. It's when you're sitting in the ops room waiting for the bell to ring that the fear begins to build. And that was certainly true for me. It wasn't so much when you were actually physically doing it, it was waiting to be called out to do the next one. Now, in Northern Ireland, I was involved in it for a while, but it was relatively few. I mean, there was quite a lot, but in contrast to what people were doing in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, the operators who were operating there in the last few years, where they were dealing with dozens of IEDs a day, literally, that was a much more difficult situation in my view, and they were displaying greater courage in the sense that they had to keep on going, and therefore they suffered, I think, greater pressure than I had suffered in Northern Ireland.
Let me take you back to the moment when you said, so you were brought up in a sort of conventional type of English Christian household where Christianity was there but not very prominent and not very explicit maybe. But you then came to the faith in a much more vigorous way when you were in your 30s, I think you said. What brought you to that point? What was it, do you think?
Well, it's a question that anybody asks. Why do you end up as a Christian? It's very difficult to answer. Why am I ended up as a Christian when one of my brothers, for example, is certainly not a Christian? I think for me it was a number of things. I said earlier on that I wanted to get confirmed when I was at Sandhurst, which was quite unusual. And my wife and I, when we got married, had communion at our wedding, which was very unusual. But we were church goers, I would say that we were not Christians. It was churchianity, not Christianity. And church was not unimportant, but it was something we did because we felt it was the right thing to do, and we had friends in the church and so on. I then served in Northern Ireland, I served in Germany, and I then went on a United Nations tour in Cyprus, on a peacekeeping tour in Cyprus. And I was there for a year, and over the Easter weekend, I managed to get 4 days off, and my wife and I flew to Jerusalem with a UN plane. There were a number of UN operations going on at the time. There'd been the whole series of Arab-Israeli wars in 56 and 67 and 73 and so on. So we managed to get to Jerusalem as tourists, and we were there over the Easter weekend. On the Easter Sunday, we went to the church, the Anglican Cathedral, for Easter Sunday service, because we just thought it would be nice to do. And it was a very good service, I remember it quite well. But over coffee, somebody then said, had we been to the Garden Tomb? Now, I'd never heard of the Garden Tomb. But the Garden Tomb is a possible, I think probable, site where Jesus was crucified and buried. And it's outside the old city wall. It's got a first century wine press. It's got a first century cave or burial area. And it's near a rock, near one of the gates in Jerusalem, that's shaped like a skull. All of that is described in the Gospels, particularly John's Gospel, as where Jesus was crucified. So we'd actually walked past this rock earlier that day, because I remembered seeing it. It didn't really register for any other reason than it just looked like a skull. So I knew roughly where we were to go, and my wife and I went that afternoon to the Garden Tomb. And in the way the good Lord operates sometimes, I think, the guide that day was a retired British Army colonel, which was extraordinary, really. And he took us under his wing. It was relatively quiet. It's a very peaceful place. Less so now. I think it's more touristy than it used to be, but it was very quiet and peaceful. And he sat us down and talked us through why he believed this was the place. Talked us through John's Gospel. And then he said, look, this may or may not be the place, but it's Easter Sunday, and if you go and look in the tomb is empty. And I'm not quite sure what I expected to find when I stood up to walk over to this tomb. I'm feeling a bit of an idiot, really, but I leant on the entrance to this tomb, and I just found myself thinking, this is really an important question. I mean, it was a question I'd sort of understood to some degree previously, but as I leant there that day, I found myself thinking, if Christ did not rise from the dead on this first Easter Sunday, then millions and hundreds of millions of people have been wasting their time for thousands of years following a religion that is completely meaningless. I mean, Paul says in one of his letters, if Christ did not rise from the dead, then we are to be more pitied than anybody. So on the one hand, that's one option. On the other hand, if he did actually rise from the dead, then that's got to mean something. And it's got to mean something more than just pretending to be nice and go to church and all that other stuff. So it wasn't quite a Damascus Road experience, but we went back to Cyprus, and over the next couple of months, I studied the scriptures, I spoke with people I respected. I had a very good friend who was a Christian officer at the time, and spent some time with him and the Padre. And then I think, like all of us, and this is my challenge really to many people, is you can't sit on the fence and just pretend, in inverted commas, all the time. You have to make a decision. And so I found myself saying, I'm going to have to make a decision one way or the other. Either this is right, and therefore it's going to have to change me and the way I operate, or I can forget it and let's stop mucking about and going to church and all the rest of it. And I decided to become what I would now say would be a disciple of Christ. And it was a transforming time. It was a very important time for me.
How did it impact on your life then? What changed after that experience?
Well, I'm a fairly head-driven bloke. I mean, I like to think I've got a bit of a heart, but I had to intellectually tackle this issue. But having made the decision, I then found myself in a much better position to have conversations with other people about the Christian faith. But it also changed the way I led. I don't think I did become a different leader. I mean, I'd like to think a better leader in the way that I understood people. And I began to realize some of the things we were discussing earlier about the world we live in, the fallen world, the evil, the sin, the reality of that. And so soldiers who see this stuff are not, they ask some pretty sensible questions. And I found myself having those conversations with soldiers, not trying to beat them over the head with the Bible or convert them, but just trying to put them in a context of how I saw the world from that point. And also, I think, being much more recognizing much more the reality and the frailty of people, and less of a dogmatic command and control leader, and more of a, I mean, in a way I hesitate to use the word, but nurturing and empathetic leader. And I now see leadership as a very different, to how I saw it previously, as a mixture of head and heart, of being able to work with people on both sides of that spectrum.
Tell me, when you look at the Church of England today, I mean, it has many critics, the Church. You are still an Anglican, and you're a sincere and faithful Anglican. But what do you think of the condition of the Church of England today?
Well, I'm a lay minister in the Church of England. I became a lay minister in the 1990s. I actually looked at it later on after the 1981, the time of the Garden Tomb, and I gave up because I didn't understand the questions, never mind about the answers. I mean, it was all too difficult, really. It was very intellectual. But I became a lay minister in the 1990s. I think there's two or three things. One is, I think it's good that society has changed, that doesn't expect people in some sort of socially acceptable way to go into church and so on. So although many people take great joy in saying there aren't as many people going to church every Sunday, the fact is that the people who are going because they want to be there, and many of them are very committed. And there are still people who come, of course, to search and to ask questions and so on. But there was some research done recently by Theos, who I work with, that basically says that around 4 to 4.5 million people go to a Christian place of worship every week. It's not the same 4.5 million. So some people go once a week, some people go once a fortnight, some people go 3 or 4 times a year. So there are millions of people who are going to a Christian place of worship in this country week by week by week. That's more than go to all the sport that's watched and all sorts of other stuff. And the Church of England is very much a part of that. It is smaller, in inverted commas, than it previously was, but it is still, I think, an important part of, well, clearly the Christian faith as a whole, but also in the way that it is part of the establishment, part of the infrastructure and so forth of our nation. I mean, I happen to know the current Archbishop very well, and I happen to like him a lot, and he gets a lot of flack and criticism, but then leadership's often a lonely place, and we live in a society today that's more ready to criticise. But I think he and the bishops and the average vicar running a church anywhere in this country are people who are very dedicated, who believe in what it is that they're preaching, and work hard to deliver the gospel and to draw people into the kingdom of God, which is ultimately what this is about. This is about not what happens next week or the week after. It's about eternity. It's about what happens, after we die and so forth. Drawing people closer to Christ, facing them with the gospel, and asking them the questions. And, like as I said earlier, trying to get people to make a decision. Now, they're perfectly free to walk away if they want to, but I've watched a lot of people come to faith over the last 10 or 15 years, and actually, I think, interestingly, a lot more people are asking themselves questions that they weren't asking themselves 10 or 20 years ago.
When I look at the Church of England, I'm not an Anglican myself, but when I look at the Church of England, I do wonder sometimes about the way that it approaches cultural issues. And it seems sometimes that the Church is quite woke in its approach to cultural issues. It seems to sympathise with every fashionable victim group. I wonder what you make of that, and if that concerns you at all, the way that the Church engages with the culture.
Well, there's aspects to the culture of our nation that makes me uneasy. But I think, we need to be honest about the fact that Jesus, as I said earlier, was not religious. The people he spent time with were the poor and the people who are outcast and so forth. And he bumped up against the authorities of his day in a lot of ways while he was on his ministry. And of course, ultimately, they're the ones who took him to the cross and crucified him. So individuals matter to the church, and they should matter to the church. And it's not up to us to judge people. That's the good Lord's to do that. But you do end up in a situation where the pressures to adapt to cultural changes can impinge on preaching the gospel. And I think it's a very difficult line. The church has always been involved in politics, because if you believe that poverty matters and people matter and the way they live their lives matter, you're bound to bump into politics, because ultimately, that's what politics is about. But Christianity is deeper than that. I mean, there's a long story that Jonathan Sacks used to tell, which is, I think he was a great man, a great loss when he died recently, relatively recently. But he would talk about going on the London Eye, and as you get in a pod on the London Eye and you look out at what's laid out in front of you, and imagine you've got a son or a grandson alongside you or a granddaughter, and they ask you what's out there, and he would tell the story of pointing to Parliament and explaining what politics is about and how it's generated and distributed, and then pointing to the City of London over to the right and explaining about economic power and so forth. And then the child tugging you by the arm, pointing to St Paul's Cathedral and Westminster Abbey and saying, what are those places for? What do they do? And there is something different about those places. They are the places that set the moral foundation of a nation, that challenge economics and politics, and they should do, and Jesus did too. So I don't have a problem, I've never had a problem with the church being accused of being involved in politics or whatever, because I think it has to. The question is, how does it preach the gospel, and does it bring people into the kingdom, and how does it set about doing that? Some of the changes that have gone on in society I don't think have been very beneficial for society, and clearly one's always careful not to tread on toes here. But, for example, I think David Steer was incredibly naive in 1967 when he passed the abortion bill. I'm not against abortion wholesale. I think there are times and circumstances, and an ectopic pregnancy is an abortion in theory and practical terms. But the result of that bill has been millions of unborn children who've never seen life as a result of that bill. The numbers have grown dramatically, and the numbers who come under the original intent of that bill are probably less than 5% or 10% of those abortions that are carried out. So we've had millions of children die. We have abortions now over 200,000 a year. So in the context of coronavirus and COVID, which we've lost 160, 170,000, tragic deaths, mostly older people, at the same time, over that 2-year period, getting on for 500,000 children never even saw life. Now, should the church speak out about that? I think it should. Should the church speak out about the current debate about assisted suicide, which again I think is incredibly naive? Of course it's emotional, and of course you have terrible stories, but once you open the door to legally allowing people to be killed, assisted in suicide, the numbers will escalate over time. So we need to speak out against these beginning and end of life issues. Marriage, I think, is the bedrock of any society. I'm lucky. I've been married for 50 years. I never went out with anybody else other than my wife. I've never kissed any other woman other than my wife, literally, which people find extraordinarily either stupid or naive, I don't know. But anyway, that's the reality of it. So I've been very lucky. So I need to be, in that sense, I need to be careful. But the breakdown of marriage, I think, is a hugely important issue. I hate this word partner. I had tennis partners and bridge partners and, people that I played sport with and so forth, golf partners. And when my golf didn't match up to their golf, they said, thanks very much, goodbye. I want to find somebody else, or tennis or bridge or whatever. Partners carry with it the whole idea in business. We work together as long as it is useful for you and I to work together. But when it stops, we just walk away. That's not what marriage is. Husbands and wives the marriage vows are, will you be with this person through thick and thin, bad health and good health, financial trouble and so forth, till the end of your life? Will you do that? It's an attitude of mind, of the will. Not, oh, we're going through a bit of a bad week, I think I'm going to move on because the pasture's greener over there and I'm going to go and have an affair or whatever. I mean, we now read stories of people saying having affairs is good for you, for your marriage. Complete rubbish. So those sorts of issues, I think the church has to speak out strongly about, and I think it's struggling to do so because it doesn't want to offend people and it doesn't want to be seen to be overly harsh on people's decisions that they take for their lives. So what we have to present is, this is the ideal, this is God's plan, if you like, for the way we should live. This is the Maker's instructions. And of course we fail, all of us fail to make that in its entirety, but we shouldn't be afraid of speaking out and saying that's what we should be aiming to do.
Isn't the problem here that in an age when self-fulfillment is presented to people as the greatest good, that go out and live your life as you will, according to your own rules, and find self-fulfillment through that expression of your inner self? That, of course, is a doctrine, isn't it, which encourages people just to go and enjoy themselves in many ways. What you're talking about is self-discipline. It's a countercultural message as far as this contemporary culture is concerned. How can the church actually go into combat on those issues without a greater degree of moral courage, perhaps? Because it's not going to make you popular saying these things, is it? And I do fear that not just the Anglican Church, all churches, they want to be popular.
Yes, they do. They want to be welcoming, and they want to value people individually. But nonetheless, we need to establish, I think, that life is not about me. I mean, what we're living in is a generation of iPad, iPod, selfie, and the social media world and so forth, where it's all about me. And I don't think that's healthy as a society, and I don't think it's healthy for individuals. God created us in relationship, to be in relationship with Him and with other people around us. Now, again, we need to be careful not to be sweepingly judgmental. Watch the reaction to what's going on in Ukraine, people's giving during, monetary giving during hardship and tragedy and so forth, and people opening up their homes and doing all sorts of stuff. So that individuals can respond beautifully to the realities of a broken world around us. But collectively, I do think over the last 20, 30 years, we are generating a culture of individuality. That it's about me and my needs, and I want to be happy day by day in life. And if something is happening to me that doesn't make me happy, then I want to get rid of it. I want to move on. Instead of working through. Life is tough, and working through the toughness is part of, what we have to do. So I think speaking out against the selfie generation, the selfishness of the way we live our lives today, is really important. And the church does have to do that. It has to do it, though, in a way that says, God loves you. He died for you. Christ came here and died for you, and He cares about you, and He wants you to live a fulfilled life in all its fullness. And that means in the tough times and the rough times and the bad relationships that we have to face up to and move through. And therefore not giving up on things just because it's not very pleasant is not the right answer.
You and me both are of a similar generation. We're close in age. I wonder, do you think, looking back, that the country was a better place when you were a young man, or a worse place? I mean, from my own perspective, I would say there have been some gains. I think that perhaps society is more tolerant these days of individuals who back in the day didn't quite fit in, but at the same time it's difficult to escape a feeling that there has been a moral deterioration in some ways. I mean, what would you say to that? Do you think the good old days, or what do you think?
Well, it definitely changed. I mean, there's no doubt about that. It was a very different country. I joined the Army as a cadet in 1964. It was only 20 years after D-Day. Everybody had been involved in the military one way or the other over those years. And it was, of course, the population was much less. Most people lived completely different lives to the way they live their lives today, in all sorts of ways. The work they did, the heavy industries that we had in the country at the time, big military, lots of people in the military and so forth, very largely white, and very largely, living in communities and towns where people very rarely left. I mean, that's the case even to some degree today, but they lived their lives in relatively closed ways. And there were very good aspects to that. I mean, the community, the sense of community, I think, was very strong in those days. But it wasn't a perfect world by any manner of means. But when we look at today's world, it is much more multicultural. It is much more dynamic. There are things, I think, that are very positive changes. I mean, it must be right that a woman does not have to live with a husband who beats her up every day. She should be allowed to escape from that, which, previous generations, people couldn't in all sorts of ways. It must be right that we now expose all the nasty things that happen to children, or, what goes on and so forth. So, there are very many positive things about the world we live in today. But the danger is that go back to our earlier point, we lose that sense of community, we become very selfish in the way we see the world, and we demand everything for ourselves.
Do you think it's a good thing? Do you think it's been an advance, for instance, that gay people or people who don't fit the hetero template in sexuality terms, do you think it's a good thing overall that people feel freer now to be themselves in whatever form that takes?
Overall, I think it must be right that people can live their own lives the way they want to live them. But the point is, what does that do to society as a whole? How does society view the different approaches to living, in inverted commas? So you go back to something like marriage. I happen to believe that marriage between a man and a woman is the best way of living family life, raising children and so on. Now, does that mean that I wouldn't want any other people to live their lives in any other way? No, they have to make their own choices. But I do think we need to be careful about endorsing the fact that all choices, are equal. The reality is that all choices carry consequences. I mean, it's one of my mantras in life, whether that's in politics or military world or indeed in our personal lives. So some of the things that we've been through very quickly over the last 10, 20 years, I don't think we will really understand the consequences of those probably for another 30 or 40 years. I mean, going back to my earlier point, the Abortion Act in '67, I remember the stories. I remember the backstreet abortion clinics, and I remember the passionate debates that were at the time. The reality is we now, all these years later, best part of 60 years later, understand the implications of allowing that to happen. And I don't think we'll understand the implications of family life and the way our society, the strands of society hold together, probably for another 20 or 30 years. Something like, well, as I understand it, over 50% of children are now raised in single homes. Now, my own daughter is a single mum. I don't condemn all single mothers, but do I think it's a good thing that half the children in this country are being raised by single mums? I don't, actually. And I think men, have been allowed to escape all sorts of responsibilities that they should have been forced to, to hang on to. So those consequences will only really come to hit home, I think, in due time. So
the equality agenda, so-called, has carried all before it. But what you're saying is, if I read you right, that there is an objective truth here, that there is right and there is wrong. And surely that is the, if you like, the difficult message which all the churches are trying to get across, that actually we are not entitled, or it does not lead to human happiness if we construct our own sense of right and wrong. If we allow ourselves to go down that path, we end up in a sort of moral chaos. Do you agree with that?
I do. Overall, I agree with that. Now, again, individual people make their own choices, and there are brilliant single mums bringing up children brilliantly, and I, wouldn't want to, in any sense, condemn them. But do I think it would be better if there was a husband around? Yes, I would. I mean, truth is, I lecture on truth in different ways, and truth is interesting. And of course, the classic example is Jesus standing in front of Pontius Pilate, and Pontius Pilate says, "What is truth?" And the irony is he's standing right in front of him. There is biblical truth. Jesus came and brings truth, and he talks about the counselor who will bring us the truth, and so on. So there's a truth in that sense of us, the spiritual life that we are called to. There is also a truth that says there are better ways of living and there are worse ways of living. And drawing that line is not easy. I mean, I mean it when I say that the British Army is deeply flawed because it's made up of people like me. I am a sinner. And Paul says, you know, that there was no greater sinner than he. That's a reality. I make choices that are bad and flawed and I get things wrong. But ultimately, I'm aiming, the intent is to live as close as I can to that truth that I believe is right, not just for me, but for the society, the community and society that I live in. So I do think there is such a thing as truth, yes. And I do think we need to be prepared to speak out when we think that people are pushing, you know, or going the wrong way and taking us down paths we shouldn't be going down. You know, and I think we see that in lots of different ways. I've mentioned other regimes. I mean, it's very interesting. The latest statistics show that something like 20% of the world's population live in what we understand as liberal free democracies, where the sort of conversations we're having. Almost twice that number live in autocratic regimes, and the rest live somewhere in between with some sort of restrictions. Those autocratic regimes, you know, are pretty awful places in terms of some of the things we've been talking about. So I want to live in a free liberal democracy. I want people to be free to make their own choices. But I also want them to understand the consequences of those choices, not just for themselves, but for the broader communities and society in which they live, and be prepared to speak out about that.
Tim Cross, thank you.